My name is Kazma Chaudhry, and I'm presenting my undergrad thesis on Facebook and its effects on capturing attention, inducing flow, and maladaptively providing relief from depression. For context, I completed my thesis in August of 2020. I also have a poster submission that summarizes my thesis, which I will be going over in this presentation. Let's have a look at why it's worth studying the psychological implications of using Facebook. I worked on my thesis around 2018 and 19, and this was the state of Facebook's user base at the time of this study. Facebook still continues to be the most used social network site worldwide. When looking at some of the reporting around Facebook as a social media company, there have been many concerning red flags in the gray literature. Facebook's founding president publicly stated that the company aims to consume as much user time as possible, and it seems to be working. We can see the results reflected in these statistics, with almost 50% of users reporting that social media increased distractions during their day. This kind of distracting, repetitive behavior can also be seen in problem gambling. Interestingly, there have also been many claims in the gray literature and by Facebook employees themselves comparing social media to slot machines and following a similar problematic and maladaptive use pattern as those who experience problem gambling. In her research at slot machine casinos and talking to gamblers, Natasha Dowshall coined the term the slot machine zone as a form of escapism in everyday life. The slot machine zone is characterized by a pleasurable feeling of becoming completely engrossed and zoned in during slot machine play, and experiencing a sense of dissociation and a loss of time. Experimental research by my supervisor and work at his gambling research lab have made parallels between the slot machine zone and a cognitive state called dark flow, related to the theory of flow. The flow state was originally coined by Csikszentmihalyi in the field of positive psychology as a cognitive state associated with positive skill-based activities such as playing chess or sports. It's characterized by the feeling of being completely engaged and zoned into the activity and experiencing a sense of dissociation and loss of time. However, Csikszentmihalyi himself warned of the potentially negative implementations of the flow state, which has been coined as dark flow by my supervisor, Dr. Dixon, at the gambling lab. Dark flow is similarly all-encompassing and engaging, but is instead associated with negative chance-based activities such as gambling. Interestingly, this concept of the flow state has also been briefly explored in the context of social media in the gray literature. The research question that this thesis aimed to explore was, does Facebook rein in the depressed, wandering mind similar to problematic slot machine use? To test this experimentally, we incorporated the use of a boring control condition with a digital interface, but without the attention-grabbing interface features found on Facebook. The task consisted of a digital pegboard with pegs that rotate 90 degrees clockwise when clicked on, which participants were instructed to continue rotating during this condition. We measured everyday mind wandering and depression using the Mindfulness Attention Awareness Scale, the MAS, and the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale, the DAS-21. We predicted that depressed Facebook users will experience increased mind wandering during this boredom-inducing task, and the process of reined-in attention observed during Facebook will not be observed during the control condition. How can we measure this? We assessed in-task mind wandering by periodically interrupting participants during this boring control task using thought probe methodology, and asked whether their thoughts were on task or off task, with off-task responses being linked to mind wandering. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So given a boring, repetitive task, we would expect increased mind wandering and a reduction of positive affect. Directly following the task, we measured positive affect and flow using the game's experiences questionnaire. Since mind wandering is antithetical to the locked-in attentional state described in the flow state, we would expect this boring task to trigger very little flow. But how might one rein in these wandering minds? Based on research from the gambling lab that found depressed gamblers to be using slot machines as a means of escape, in this thesis study, we propose that you can replace slot machines with Facebook, and it'll similarly rein in attention and follow the same problematic mechanisms. We hypothesized that depressed Facebook users experiencing mindfulness problems in everyday life and depressed rumination will find it difficult to focus and achieve flow in daily life. But when using Facebook, their attention is reined in, and they can effortlessly concentrate, which distracts from their negative ruminations. They are able to achieve positive affect and flow, unlike in daily life, providing relief from negative ruminations. Using Facebook for these users may improve mood, but it will be maladaptive, reinforcing this cycle where they turn to Facebook to improve mood and act as an escape. Based on previous research by the Gambling Lab, we proposed some hypothesized correlations. First, we predicted a positive correlation between depression and mind wandering in everyday life. So people who rate higher in depression would also rate higher in everyday mind wandering. Next, we predicted a positive correlation between depression and in-task mind wandering during the control task. In other words, those who rate higher in depression would report higher levels of mind wandering when completing the pegboard control task. However, this effect would be eliminated during Facebook use. In other words, Facebook would rein in participants' attention and they would report fewer instances of mind wandering during Facebook compared to the control task. And lastly, participants would report higher levels of retrospective positive affect and dark flow directly following the Facebook condition compared to the control. Let's have a closer look at the research methods. Participants consisted of 40 University of Waterloo students who reported using Facebook at least daily or every other day. The study followed an experimental within subjects counterbalance design. Participants completed both the Facebook and control conditions. In terms of procedure, this study first started off as an in-person lab study completed on a lab computer. But following the closures with the COVID-19 pandemic, we shifted to an online remote format completed by participants on their personal computers, moderated by the researcher over Zoom. Each condition lasted 12 minutes, with 6 in-task thought probes administered every 2 minutes within each task. Following the completion of each condition, participants completed the GEQ based on their experiences of the Facebook condition and the control condition. Following the completion of both conditions, participants completed the MAS and the DAS-21. The entire session lasted approximately 60 minutes. Results. We found that depression significantly correlated with mindfulness problems in everyday life. Considering that the MAS measured mindfulness rather than mind wandering, this is actually depicted as a negative correlation between the scale scores. We also found that depressed participants were more likely to mind wandering during the control task. You'll notice the 2 participants that scored highest in depression were also among the least likely to report being on task. However, that correlation disappeared during Facebook use as predicted. This effect indicates that Facebook did indeed rein in the wandering mind for our participants. You can also note the movement of the 2 participants scoring highest in depression reporting being more on task during Facebook use compared to the control. And lastly, in-task experience indicated higher reports of on-task responses, dark flow, and positive affect during Facebook use as compared to the control. Together, the findings from the study illustrate this picture. Facebook users who experience depression and mind wandering in everyday life report being more likely to have trouble remaining on task and attentive during everyday life. However, the attention-grabbing features of the Facebook interface reins in their attention, resulting in more feelings of being engaged and on task, the task at hand being using Facebook and being attentive to its content. Next, dark flow is induced as a result of this reined-in attention. And lastly, the reined-in attention and dark flow together induce a positive affect in the Facebook user, similar to a slot machine player. Anytime these users find their mind wandering to dark places, they use Facebook to elevate their mood and rein in their wandering mind. This is obviously a maladaptive reinforcement mechanism because they'll find that they're repeatedly using Facebook to elevate their mood. Therefore, they find themselves spending way too much time on Facebook when they should be attending to their day-to-day tasks. This has important implications for the use of Facebook as a maladaptive coping mechanism and escape from mindfulness problems and depression in everyday life, similar to the problem gambler. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions about this research.